The very peace plan of Donald Trump, which they developed together with the Russians, has appeared online, and the points outlined there will be very displeasing to Ukraine and Europe. And today, the Financial Times writes that Ukraine is under tremendous pressure to quickly agree to the peace plan developed by the Trump administration together with Moscow to end the war. In addition, at the White House, specifically, White House spokesperson Caroline Leavitt confirmed today that yes, indeed, Steve Witkoff and Marco Rubio, together with the Russians, have been privately developing a peace plan over the past month. Out of the 28 points that were presented today, at least officially, to Ukraine. Unofficially, the Ukrainian authorities saw this plan a few days ago. Obviously, Ukraine cannot accept all 28 points. But it is reported that the White House insists that Zelensky accept this peace plan by November 27, that is, by next Thursday, so that it's done by the end of the month. Trump has already announced that supposedly Ukraine and Russia have made peace with each other according to this very peace plan. So, let's go through this peace plan point by point together. Let's look at it while it's still fresh and see what different sides are reporting. Most importantly, what's in this peace plan? My name is Alexei Pechi. Now let's dive into this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, hit like, and leave any comment you want. Don't forget to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Peachy News. The link is in this video's description. So, I'll start with the fact that today the Financial Times is the first to report that Zelensky and the office of the president are under tremendous pressure from Washington for Ukraine to quickly agree to Donald Trump's peace plan, which was developed with the Russians. The Financial Times writes that officials familiar with this document say they compare the United States' approach to the aggressive push earlier this spring for a minerals agreement that was unfavorable for Kyiv. Ukrainian officials said Trump's team told Zelensky's team the White House aims to finalize the proposal and end the war by year's end. In other words, to stop the war before the year ends. According to them, American officials expect Zelensky to sign the agreement by Thanksgiving, by next Thursday, November 27, with the aim of presenting the peace agreement in Moscow at the end of November and completing the process at the beginning of December. That is, so that Zelensky signs by the 27th, then by December 1st the people in Moscow sign, and the deal is done. Such a schedule looks extremely unrealistic, because Zelensky's team says there are several points in the plan that are obvious red lines for Kyiv. They are already saying that there is a counterproposal for the American side, in particular, a peace plan developed together with the Europeans which consists of 12 points, and Ukraine is actively promoting it. In addition, Ukrainian civil society will likely strongly oppose any agreement that is perceived as a capitulation or as being too favorable to Moscow. That's it. Well, and now, Ukrainian officials insist that this is essentially a fossil fuels agreement version 2.0. They mean it's unchanged since February this year. And Zelensky, was very aggressively pressured to agree to the deal, but Ukraine did not agree. It was revised multiple times. This continued for weeks until it was signed. Fortunately, Zelensky didn't sign it immediately because the terms were very unfavorable. That's it. Well, and in the White House? Today, White House spokesperson Caroline Leavitt reported that Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, quote, have been quietly working on the plan for the past month. The president supports this plan, she said. It's a good plan for both Russia and Ukraine. We believe it should be acceptable to both sides, and we are working very hard to implement it. By the way, the European Union also responded. And here's Kaja Kallas, the European Union's representative for foreign affairs, who simply said, "We haven't heard of any concessions from the Russian side." Well, let's move on to Donald Trump's so-called peace plan. These documents have already appeared. Let's quickly review the main points, then discuss each in detail. Ukrainian Deputy Oleksiy Honcharenko has published the peace plan of United States President Donald Trump. The document contains the following key provision. As we mentioned, there are several sections. The first section is about territorial issues. Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk are de facto Russian territories. Kherson and Zaporizhia remain frozen along the contact line, while Ukraine withdraws from part of Donetsk. A demilitarized buffer zone will be established, as we discussed. Specifically, the 15% of territories under Ukrainian control will be a demilitarized zone. Next is security and international status. Ukraine's constitution rejects joining NATO, and NATO legally confirms it will never admit Ukraine. The number of Ukraine's armed forces is limited, capped at 600,000 people, 600,000 and no more. The deployment of NATO troops on Ukrainian territory is prohibited. Next are the economic aspects. Russia is gradually returning to the global economy with the lifting of all sanctions. A reconstruction fund is being established using $100 billion of frozen Russian assets. The United States and Europe are investing in the reconstruction of Ukrainian infrastructure and economy. The next section is guarantees and control. Ukraine is provided with security guarantees, and an American-Russian working group is being established to monitor the implementation of the agreement. Russia legally enshrines a policy of non-aggression towards Europe and Ukraine. At what point did we start believing the Russians? The nuclear non-proliferation treaties are being extended. This is between the United States and Russia. The next point is humanitarian issues. A complete exchange of prisoners of war and the return of civilian hostages is being carried out. Ukraine holds elections 100 days after the agreement is signed. Full amnesty is provided for all participants in the conflict. And Trump is demanding that Zelensky sign this plan right now. Let's discuss this plan in more detail, having reviewed it block by block. And next, I'll show you actual screenshots of that very document. In the first section, the first point states that Ukraine's sovereignty will be confirmed, which seems very strange because the next part actually deals with limiting the Ukrainian army, which in itself is a violation of sovereignty. Here, those who wrote this plan need to read the definition of the word sovereignty. The second point is quite interesting. A comprehensive non-aggression agreement between Russia, Ukraine, and Europe will be concluded. All ambiguities of the past 30 years will be considered resolved. What ambiguities? Next, it is expected that Russia will not invade neighboring countries, and NATO will not expand any further. It is further stated that a dialogue will be held between Russia and NATO, mediated by the United States, to resolve all issues, security issues and creating conditions for de-escalation, to ensure global security and increase opportunities for cooperation and future economic development. Ukraine must receive reliable security guarantees. That's what the plan says, but it doesn't specify which ones. Next, the number of Ukraine's armed forces is reduced and limited to 600,000 people. The Ukrainian army will not be expanded under any circumstances. Limiting it is the only guarantee of security. Ukraine agrees to enshrine in its constitution that it will not join NATO, and NATO enshrines in its constitution, well, its so-called constitution. What is meant is that in the charter documents, it will be stated that Ukraine will never join these ranks in the future. The government of the country may change, and so on, but it will be fixed in NATO that Ukraine will not join. I emphasize, this is yet another limitation of Ukraine's sovereignty. The first point of Trump's second plan is that Ukraine's sovereignty will be confirmed. So, there are already 2 points that are violated: the army and joining NATO. And the 8th point is that NATO commits not to deploy troops in Ukraine. This is bad. European fighter jets will be stationed in Poland. It's unclear why this needs to be written down. Next, the guarantee from the United States of America is not specified. The United States will receive compensation for security guarantees. Well, Trump wouldn't be Trump if he didn't demand some kind of compensation. It's unclear who will be paying it. Most likely, it's a hint that Ukraine will get security guarantees but must pay for them. Next, if Ukraine invades Russia, it will lose that very security guarantee. But Ukraine isn't planning to invade Russia. Why would it? The only question here is whether the United States will consider the occupied Ukrainian territories as Russian or not. And let's say, hypothetically, that the armed forces of Ukraine go to reclaim all of Donbass. In this case, does America consider it Russian territory, or is it still Ukrainian territory? This document doesn't specify that, but it does state that if Russia invades Ukraine, there will be a decisive, coordinated military response. All global sanctions will be reinstated, and the recognition of new territory and all other benefits from this agreement will be cancelled. Well, I mean, these are not guarantees. These are not guarantees. It's written in such a way that, like, if Russia attacks again, then everything that happened after the agreement just gets cancelled. Sanctions and military aid to Ukraine resume, but what guarantees are there they won't attack? That's what's missing. If Ukraine launches missiles at Moscow or St. Petersburg without cause, as stated in the document, security guarantees will be void. Strange. Well, this is clearly a Russian trace. They stated in the document that if Ukraine launches missiles at Moscow or Petersburg without cause, that's it. And then Ukraine has the right to membership in the European Union and will get short-term preferential access to the European market. This issue is still under consideration. It's an interesting point. It's good. So, Ukraine will join the European Union, but while this procedure is ongoing, we will receive preferences on the European market. Super. 12th point. A strong, powerful global package of measures, a strong global package of actions for the recovery of Ukraine, which includes, but is not limited to, the creation of a Ukraine Development Fund for investment in. That is, in various fields including technology, data centers, and artificial intelligence. Super. Ukraine is said to become a leading hub for artificial intelligence and advanced technologies. The United States of America will cooperate with Ukraine for the joint restoration, development, modernization, and operation of Ukraine's gas infrastructure, which includes pipelines and storage facilities. Joint efforts to restore territories affected by the war, for the restoration, reconstruction, and modernization of cities and residential areas. Further, the development of infrastructure and the extraction of minerals and natural resources. The World Bank will develop a special financing package to accelerate these goals. Russia will be reintegrated into the global economy. Honestly, not great. The lifting of sanctions will be discussed and implemented gradually on a case-by-case basis. That's bad, because these are perks from Donald Trump to Russia to get them to make a deal at all. It's being discussed that the sanctions will be lifted gradually. Next, the United States of America will sign a long-term agreement on economic cooperation aimed at mutual development in the fields of energy, natural resources, infrastructure, artificial intelligence, and data centers. Projects for the extraction of rare metals, those very rare earth metals in the Arctic, and so on and so forth. Well, kind of. Here, it's clear that the G8 will most likely be restored. At least, that's what the Americans have planned. And this is a separate point. Moving on. It is stated that the frozen money of Russians will be used as follows. $100 billion of frozen Russian funds will be invested in. That means the funds in which the United States of America will play the leading role. The United States of America will receive 50% of the profits from this venture. Europe will contribute an additional $100 billion, boosting funds for Ukraine's reconstruction. The frozen European funds will be unfrozen. The remaining funds will be invested in a separate American-Russian investment instrument, which will implement joint American-Russian projects in areas that will be specified a little later. This fund will be aimed at strengthening relations, international Vaegen. It turns out that $100 billion from frozen Russian assets will go towards the reconstruction of Ukraine. And somehow, another $100 billion should be paid by Europe for the reconstruction of Ukraine. Why should Europe pay? Did Europe attack Ukraine? And the remaining frozen Russian assets will go to a fund where Americans and Russians will do business together. That's very strange. Next, a joint American-Russian working group on security issues will be created to ensure the implementation of all the provisions of this agreement. Okay, point 16. Russia will legally establish a policy of non-aggression towards Europe and Ukraine. Well, listen, they can establish whatever they want because they never follow through on anything anyway. Next, the United States and Russia agree to extend nuclear treaties, while Ukraine agrees to remain non-nuclear. And then, point 19. Here we run into something that neither Ukraine will agree to, nor is Russia likely to agree to. Point 19 sounds like this. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant will be operated under the supervision of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the electricity generated will be distributed equally between Russia and Ukraine, 50-50. The Russians would never agree. They'll insist, we captured this plant, it's ours. Point 20. Both sides will be required to implement it. This is actually a very interesting point, introducing programs in schools and in society in general that will foster tolerance for different cultures and prevent the spread of racism. Well, basically, it's a hint that, like in Ukraine, they should say that Russian-speaking people, Russians and so on, are accepted. That's normal, it's just a different culture. They're not savages next door, just different. And of course, under this pretext, there's the promotion of the Russian language as a second official language. You know, here I want to say, tell that to the Russians, because they're the ones who want to destroy Ukrainians, not the other way around. Excuse me, but it's in Moscow where people from the Caucasus are called unpleasant names, not in Kiev. Ukraine will next adopt the European Union's rules on religious tolerance, national minorities, and Russian language protection. Both sides come to an agreement. That means cancelling all discriminatory provisions and guaranteeing the rights of Ukrainian and Russian media and education. Well, that's, really funny. So basically, Russia is demanding that Ukraine introduce education in Russian in Ukraine, allow Russian media, and so on and so on. But do you really believe that Putin's Russia would allow Ukrainian media to work openly and impartially in Russia? Well, I really doubt that very much. Furthermore, all Nazi ideology and reality must be rejected and banned. Actually, no problem, there's no Nazism in Ukraine, but in Moscow they should think about how to root it out there. And then we discussed the territories. Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk will be recognized as de facto Russian, even by the United States, but Ukraine will keep Donbas. Next, Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions will be frozen along the line of contact. What will de facto recognition mean? Well, as a new border. What should we do? It's a bit strange here. One moment. Ukraine currently can't reclaim everything militarily, so the situation will likely remain at a standstill. After that, Russia will give up the other territories it controls outside the borders of the 5 regions. This is a strange point. It's like Russia is promising to leave parts of Kharkiv, Sumy, and Dnipropetrovsk regions. We're being asked to give up our Donetsk territories, once again trading Ukrainian land for Ukrainian land. Ukrainian forces are leaving the part of Donetsk region they now control, and this withdrawal zone will be considered a neutral demilitarized buffer zone, internationally recognized as territory belonging to the Russian Federation. The Russian forces will not withdraw from the entire Donbas and will not enter this demilitarized zone further. After determining future territorial agreements, both Russia and Ukraine will commit not to change these agreements by force. Any security guarantees will not apply in the event of a violation of this commitment. Ukraine currently has no guarantees, and it's unclear who, if anyone, is offering them. So, and point 23 about Russia is just ridiculous. Russia will not interfere with Ukraine using the Dnipro River for commercial activities. And agreements will be reached on the free transportation of grain across the Black Sea. Now that's a concession from Russia. That's nonsense. Point 24. A humanitarian committee will be established to resolve outstanding issues. So, an exchange of everyone for everyone, absolutely all for all. All civilians and hostages will be returned, including children. A family reunification program will be implemented. What happens next is unclear, but a clause states measures will be taken to help the conflict's victims. It's unclear what this means, what kind of alleviation of suffering for the victims of the conflict. It's not clear what's meant by that. The 5th point is that Ukraine will hold elections 100 days after the agreement is signed. All parties involved in this conflict will receive full amnesty for actions committed during the war. and they will agree not to make any claims or resolve these issues in court in the future. That means it's a full amnesty for all Russian war crimes. I emphasize, war criminals must be convicted. And Washington tells us, yes, listen, forgive Bucha, forgive Mariupol, forgive Izium, forgive all these war crimes, all these abuses by Russian soldiers against Ukrainian civilians, forgive these violations of the rules of warfare, the strikes on civilian infrastructure, on hospitals, on homes, on maternity wards, and so on. You should forgive all of these and accept that you will never even try to punish Russians for all these crimes. Point 27. This agreement will be legally binding and its implementation will be monitored and guaranteed by the Peace Council, which will be headed by Donald Jr. Trump. Sanctions will be imposed for violations. Which ones? It's unclear. And point 28. After all parties agree to this memorandum, a ceasefire will be established immediately after both sides withdraw to certain lines, which will be specified in the agreement from the beginning. Well, as you understand, Ukraine in its current form absolutely cannot agree to this memorandum. There are a lot of concessions to the Russians here. In fact, this is what's most cynical, most terrible. It's that the whole world is supposed to just turn a blind eye to all the crimes of the Russians and continue doing business with them, making deals, lifting sanctions, and bringing the Russians back into the global community, and just pretend that nothing ever happened. There were no war crimes, there was no attack, there was no destruction. Moreover, Trump says, let it be equal, equal, equal. Found it. Often a photo of Bystratsky, profile O. Two. You can read it on the Pechi News Telegram channel, but I'll take a short excerpt from here that indicates that the Americans, of course, want Kyiv to accept this peace plan very quickly. However, the negotiations will likely take longer. Quote, Special Envoy Witkoff Marco Rubio has been quietly working on the plan for about a month now. They are cooperating with both sides, Russia and Ukraine, to understand what commitments these countries are willing to make to achieve lasting peace. That's how they come to peace talks, Caroline Livet tells us. In general, in Europe right now, they still don't quite understand how to react. But everyone is saying that it's very strange that the issue of Europe's security is being discussed completely without Europe. And of course, they are calling not to push Ukraine towards capitulation. In general, I'll leave it at that for now. Friends, share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.